Yes, thank you. And no captions. So then I will do just the starting points. I'd like to welcome our guests, Alice Leal and David Spitzer. Thank you, the attendants, for the interest and wish us all a good discussion. I'd like to have a special give a special thank to Leila Darin, who cannot be with us today. She has some health problems, but she's the one who suggested the symposium at the ABRAPT meeting in Salvador. And I'd also like to thank Lauro Amorin, who promptly agreed to join the journey. We shall also thank Rosemaria Rojo, who cannot be with us today, but whose work brought together David, Alice, Leila, Mauro, and myself for a book David organized with some help of mine. I'd like to thank Rafael Azizi and the Department of Philosophy of the Federal University of Bahia for hosting the information about this antechamber of ENTRAD 2025, and later on the recording for the meeting. And then I'd like to remember that the idea of a virtual meeting goes back to the interest that Alice Leal showed in our symposium, which cannot hold virtual meetings for organizational reasons. So we try to combine the best of two worlds, virtual and presential forms. It is also inspired, this virtual meeting, by the group Philosophy on Translation, whose next virtual meeting will be held soon. But this is already a topic to be dealt with by Alice, to whom I give the floor.
Obrigada, Paulo. Thank you very much for this introduction. Bom dia, boa tarde. Hello to everyone. I was just apologizing to Paulo and to David. I seem to have caught the flu or something like that. So if I sound a bit confused or confusing, I probably am, and I apologize. But in any case, it's such a pleasure to be here. We're talking about Prismas da Tradução, né? I really like this title, Paulo. Prismas da Tradução, Transfiction, Transbordamentos, Perspectivas adjacentes e o pensamento complexo. I hope I understood this correctly. So this is basically, what you call it, a group within ENTRAD, right? That's the name of the event, which is going to take place next month in November, is it, in Bahia?
Most African of Brazilian cities.
Just 1 second. Oh, okay. I thought I was out of electricity. Oh, good. Exactly. So yeah, that's going to take place in November in Bahia. And as Paulo just pointed out, I would love to be able to be there, but unfortunately I can't. So we're going to have this discussion today. Let me thank Paulo. Paulo, I hope you know how much I appreciate you and the fact. Okay, my electricity is kind of weird, but I'm here. My laptop is working.
Yes.
Do you know what? I'm so sorry. Could you give me 1 second? Because now I'm a bit concerned. We do sometimes have power issues in South Africa. Just give me 30 seconds and let me just check my power.
Here. This is life as it is, to quote one Brazilian famous journalist. I mean, South Africa, as I was also worried because we had some weather problems here in Campinas yesterday. So in my street there were some trees that fall down and things like that. But maybe
thank you for mentioning Rosemary. Did you communicate with her about this session?
We tried, well, we did invite her to be here, but she couldn't. Rosemary is enjoying not having to participate in academic life, which has become very tough. That's not what she said, but we know academic life has become very tough. So she's just enjoying doing whatever she wants. But I mean, it's important to mention her because I mean, we wouldn't be here together if it wouldn't be for her work.
Yes, she's the translator.
Huh? Yes.
Totally is. I'm sorry again about that. I just double checked here. Everything should be fine. And yeah, it's nice that you're talking about Rosie. So I was just thanking Paulo. I think we've known each other for a number of years now, but we've never met in person, which is surreal. It's the same for David. So I guess my biggest wish at the moment is that our paths cross and we can actually meet in person. I think that would be such a
We talked
present.
about life in Curitiba a long time ago. You were a student. He was the president of the Brazilian Teachers Association in Paraná. Long time ago. But anyhow, let's go further on.
Okay, we need to talk about that, Paulo. Anyway, so I'm very glad that we have this opportunity to continue working together despite the geographical difference or distance. Sorry, that would be the right word. So thank you very much, and thank you to Leila and Lauro as well, who are not here, but who co-organized this and who obviously allowed David and me to be here, which is a great pleasure and a great honor. And David, as you know, I'm always very happy to work with you, you know, however it is that we find a way to work together. So the idea was not to prepare a formal presentation or formal slides or anything like that, because the focus should lie on the discussion, right? So this is a sort of a pre-discussion leading up to the conference later on. So this is how I approached this task. I would nevertheless like to share my screen very briefly with you, just to show you 3 quick slides which helped me sort of structure my presentation today. I hope you can see
Good.
my full screen. I hope so.
Yes, yes.
Oh, perfect. So Paulo noted this in his invitation to this event, to today's event. I think my discussion today revolves primarily around 2 recent publications, if I can say that. The one on the left is a new journal called Philosophy of Translation. And I'm sorry about the promotional material, but this was the only poster that I could find. If you're interested in the journal, I mean, obviously, if you just Google it, you're going to find it, Philosophy of Translation, Taylor and Francis. There are lots of papers online already. The full first number, which is going to be a double issue, is going to come out in the next few days, really, then organized properly as a double issue. And we would be delighted to receive your research there as well. We can talk more about this later on, but this project, so to speak, is one of the focal points of my talk today. And the other one is this volume I've recently organized with Larissa Cercel, The Translator's Visibility. It came out a couple of months ago. So that I can share sorry, these 2 works with you. Now, I think these works, they sort of bring my entire career together in a very nice way. Just as I was putting this talk, let's say, together, I was just thinking how, you know, all the different threads that make up my academic career kind of come together here. And that's what I try to display with this little graph. I see 3 research areas that are very important, which you can see here on my screen. But I think in reality, and I try to adapt this graph to represent what I was trying to say, I think a certain philosophical approach, which I connect with this pensamento complexo, right? This complex thinking that appears in the title of this event and of the event during the conference in November. I think this, again, this pensamento complexo, right? Complex thinking connects very nicely with this idea of a philosophical approach to translation. So that's why I kind of adapted the graph to make the philosophical part sort of encompass the others. Not because it's more important, but because I think that any discussion around the translator's visibility or any discussion around representations of translators and translation in fiction are permeated by this pensamento complexo, by this maybe philosophical thinking, if you like, which I think is a very welcome development that we see in recent days in translation studies. I'm just looking at my notes. I think I can stop sharing my screen. Yeah, I think sorry, yeah, because then we can focus more on each other. So I think, yeah, since working alongside my 3 co-editors for the new journal for philosophy of translation, so Alex Triclia, Sasha Herniege, and Philip Wilson, right? The 4 of us are working together towards this new journal. And since starting discussions around the journal, I've been asking myself, what does it even mean to talk about a philosophy of translation, right? Are we seeking insight from different philosophies and kind of deriving conclusions for translation, for example, in Cassin or in Zizek or, whomever? Or are we rather developing philosophies of translation from scratch? And when we're talking about, for example, tradução eixo, right, eixo translation, or when we're talking about Ubuntu, in the South African context, are these even philosophies of translation? Can we say that without kind of subscribing to a predominantly Western Anglophone notion of philosophy? Is that what we want? Is that avoidable? Do we want to avoid it, etc.? And I guess, to come back to the journal, the answer is all of the above. I think when we put the journal together, the idea was to create a platform to welcome all of that. So philosophies that exist that have an interesting intersection with translation, or developing new philosophies of translation, or simply apply a kind of a philosophical approach, and that I'd like to problematize with you, a philosophical approach to ways of perceiving translation. So to come back to eixo or Ubuntu or whatever it is that we want to kind of zoom in on. Now, staying with this topic of philosophy of translation and the journal specifically, obviously our idea on the one hand is to kind of suggest that there could be a sub-discipline, at least at first glance, sort of like a philosophy of, right? We have a philosophy of mind and a philosophy of history, and we can have a philosophy of translation. But at the same time, obviously, we don't want to create the notion of a closed community. And here I really like Derrida when he writes about community, because he says that a community should be well aware of what closes it to the incoming of the other, right? Which is also one of the definitions of deconstruction that he gives, right? Is this incoming of the other. And that the awareness of these boundaries of this community should be what causes this community to also open itself up. So this is, I think, very important to us to try and keep it open and create a platform that accepts different thinking on translation and philosophy, the intersection of these 2 disciplines. Now, I think it was Mounin who wrote, probably in the 1960s, that translation is the scandale de la linguistique contemporaine, right? The scandal of contemporary linguistics, precisely because it kind of resists systematization. It sort of stubbornly resists structure, etc. And that's why I think, translation is unavoidably, stubbornly, relentlessly philosophical, whether we like it or not, right? I think this is a fact. And it kind of pushes us to rethink how language and how meaning works. We may have a nice, neat philosophy of language, if you like, but then as soon as we translate, we realize that matters are significantly more complex than our theory wants to suggest. So that's why I think the philosophical, so to speak, potential of translation as a topic is something that cannot be ignored, and that should be fostered and developed, right? Now, I think in translation studies, and I'm coming to an end soon, I think in translation studies, we kind of have lost sight of that. And by translation studies, I mean contemporary, predominantly Western translation studies. I think there was this desire to break away, especially from linguistics, and to have our own discipline with our own funding and our own departments, etc., which is all very, very nice and all makes sense. But obviously, again, I feel, and in my academic career is a kind of a response to that, I feel that we've lost track of these philosophical potentials that are there in translation. And I think that's what I'm trying to change, perhaps, alongside, right, many other colleagues. So when we talk about the translator's invisibility, or when we talk about transfiction, I think these are very nice opportunities, or lovely opportunities, to use one of Paulo's favorite adjectives, to what's the word, to tap into this philosophical potential of translation as a topic, right? And it's also sort of an opportunity to challenge a little bit the constraints that translation theory, sensu stricto, imposes on us, right? When we look at transfiction, we're allowed to imagine any kind of potential translator or interpreter, or translation can be embedded in any kind of way, and it just allows us to think freely about what shapes and forms translation can take. And it's the same with philosophy of translation in that respect, how philosophy opens up potentially new avenues of thought without the constraints of translation theory per se. And I'd like to end with this question. Why should we do this really at all? Why should we talk about philosophy of translation? Why should we talk about transfiction? Why should we talk about the translator's invisibility, or visibility for that matter? I think now more than anything, and by now, I mean, especially, looking into AI and sort of the ramifications of that. Now, more than anything, I think we really need to remind ourselves that translation is more than a practice. I think it's more than a mere practice. And again, I say that well aware of the fact that this mere practice is what enables entire disciplines to exist, right? This practice is extremely important. But of course, translation is so much more than that. It's so much more than something that you can feed into a machine and then press a button and get a result on the other side. So I think if we, in these areas and neighboring areas, can highlight that characteristic of translation, I think that's a very welcome step. And that's why I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much. Obrigada.
We didn't talk about this, but David, I think it's better we give time to people to ask questions and to engage with the talk with Alice. Then we present, and then you make a general round. Is that okay? Okay. So the floor is open for questions. Just questions, comments.
Something in the chat?
I don't know if someone had a question.
Thank you. Oh, Eva has her hand up. Maybe Paulo can participants just open their mics.
Please, Eva, go ahead and ask.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Hello, Alice. Hello, Paulo. Hello, David. I got your name right, I hope. Alice, thank you so much for this introduction. To be honest with you, with everything that is happening when we talk about AI and how companies are now even looking at lowering the rates of translation services, and how a lot of translators are even leaving the field, it makes you think, okay, am I doing the right thing, furthering my studies, for example, with translation studies? But I'm glad I'm attending this symposium, because you said something I never thought of, actually. I know you mentioned a lot of things about philosophy, but it's only now that it hit me that indeed translation is much more than a practice. It's much more than what we think, like translating from one language to another language. It's much more than equivalence. And I like what you said, that, it's actually something that is linked to philosophy. So this is more a comment, it's not a question. You really enlightened me, and I look forward to more of this today. Thank you.
Merci, Eva. That's very kind of you to note that. And Perhaps we can, I don't know if anybody would like to comment or come in. I think obviously, again, translation is a very important practice and we should not understate or underestimate that. And obviously there are some very serious consequences, you know, coming in now because of AI. That's perhaps a different discussion. Paulo, I leave it up to you if you want to go into that. But today, yeah, I would like to highlight the fact that translation is more than a practice, and especially for us doing research on translation, there's so much more to be explored in relation to translation that goes beyond the notion of a practice.
Is that a way to highlight?
Go ahead.
Is that a way to highlight and celebrate, in a sense, what we mean by human intelligence, to contrast with what they call artificial intelligence? I am always reluctant to use that phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's a question to all of us. I mean, absolutely. And I think, I mean, from what I've seen, and believe me, in the last year or so, I've either been a part of a panel or chaired a panel on institutional translation. I think this has happened 3 times or so in the last 12 months. And the conclusion is always look at institutional translation also, especially the European Union, the United Nations. The conclusion is that, in fact, good translators and good interpreters are becoming even more of an asset, precisely because of AI, ironically, because you really need very good people to check what these machines are coming up with. And on the flip side of that, there are fewer and fewer good translators and interpreters because fewer and fewer younger people want to pursue that track because they feel that it's pointless anyway. So it's becoming a very interesting kind of profile that is just changing, I guess, with technology. But I personally don't have this very negative notion that we're all going to be replaced and there will be no translators and interpreters anymore, etc. I really don't believe that. And that's part of the reason why, right? What David is just pointed to, that there are decisive differences between what a human can come up with and what a computer can come up with.
Maybe I can make a. I'll just try to work as I did when I was an interpreter. Just look at the people and see who is trying to talk. Okay, so I would like to add: isn't Alice this the rise of intelligence? Artificial intelligence, if we can use that expression, we have to define what is intelligence. Isn't it an opportunity for a reflexive turn, a philosophical turn in translation studies? Because many of the technical difficulties that we had before can be given to the machines. Vocabulary, expressions. I just got today a message I just read in a Brazilian paper, let's say paper, it's not a paper, that WhatsApp is now giving you the opportunity of translating your chats. But I mean, there are things that those technologies cannot do. And this is thinking about how it works. And diversity. I mean, artificial intelligence cannot translate what is little known because all the things work with very, what you call large, it's large language models. That's what's in now. And I don't know. I don't know if there's a large language model for Yoruba. And all those languages that we're studying and those cultures, but also the way things are done. I mean, isn't this to some extent an opportunity for discussing translation in a theoretical level, in a philosophical level, how language functions, and there's a topic of yours, I think, ecology. language and culture ecology. Just like if we think of biodiversity, culture diversity, because if there is no resistance, language will add. I mean, could you comment on that? I don't know if it adds anything, but isn't an opportunity for a different way of approaching translation studies?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I think without wanting to insist too much on this dichotomy theory practice, right? We're all kind of tired of that as a worn out cliche, but using it nevertheless. I think we should focus on the two sides. And obviously, as a practice, there are major opportunities that arise from the use of AI. And again, I can confirm from experience in the past 12 months with institutional translation, hearing mostly from the European Union and from the United Nations, that translators and interpreters are as important as ever. For them, I mean, for large institutions, and not only governmental or transnational institutions, but also for companies. I mean, they don't necessarily want to throw all their stuff onto a platform online. I mean, there are confidentiality issues to be considered. Also, what you touch on, Paulo, the question of large language models. I mean, not all solutions, and especially not the best solutions, are going to come out of these models, right? Depending on the text type, etc. For many organizations, translation memories are much more important. They need to have institutional memory and also legal consistency in many cases. So I think AI is often portrayed as this massive threat to translation practice, and on some levels it certainly is. But it also means that more specialized translator profiles and interpreting profiles emerge that become all the more important, right? So this is the practical side of things. But then there's the theoretical side of things. And again, I absolutely agree with you, Paulo, and I guess this is the sort of the bulk of my research at the moment, to look at translation again as more than a practice, as something that makes us rethink the functioning of language, how meaning works. And obviously those questions are some of the most fundamental questions that define human nature, really. Why do we communicate? How do we communicate? What's the function of language, etc.? We may have a neat philosophy, a neat theory of language, but as soon as we translate, we realize that there are lots of other aspects that we need to take into account. And so translation always pushes us to move from one kind of uncomfortable place to the next, and that's actually very productive, I find. So again, it is, I agree with you, it is an opportunity for us to look at translation beyond the notion of a practice.
Can machines be pushed into those zones of discomfort? Or is this one of the really human dimensions?
I guess not that I know of. And that is, I guess, a question that is also deeply philosophical. No? What, as you asked before, David, what characterizes human knowledge, and is there such a thing? And we can talk about, you know, humanism and anti-humanism and post-humanism. Yeah, these are discussions to be had. And I think, again, just to keep the golden thread, in all of them, translation plays a pivotal part, right? I mean, how do we translate sensu stricto, but also sensu lato, right? I mean, what we're doing here now, in a way, is already a kind of translation in terms of trying to communicate and get in touch with others and make sense of what they're saying, etc., etc. So, yeah.
I'm curious about what begins as a technical aspect of this whole discussion, and as Alice and Paulo know, this is not my strength, the technical aspect of anything. But as I understand it, early computing developed master-slave drives. Those are the terms that were assigned to different drives on a system. As I understand it, those terms have been abandoned as computing has developed, because I think of problematic implications. And yet, even if the terms have been abandoned, I'm suspicious as to whether the aim has been abandoned. And when I turn to artificial intelligence, this surfaces very, very much for me. I wonder if a lot of popular use of artificial intelligence is still responding to and deepening a culturally specific desire for command and control. That's one of the implications in the master-slave determinations of the drives early in the computing. And I mean, does anybody else have thoughts on those implications, or do you think they just aren't present? Whether it's using artificial intelligence towards translational activities or any of the other applications it has, is there something inherently or sort of embedded in the design that is, as I said, responding to it and activating that desire for mastery? That
David is being very philosophical now. Alice, would like to comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I need to think about that, David, but I guess, I don't know, perhaps I would counter with, perhaps most human endeavors are kind of permeated by or pushed by that drive, no? To have some kind of control or some kind of power, perhaps is the word. But I don't know. I mean, I need to think about it. Now that you mentioned this terminological issue, I do remember that. I remember seeing that in old computers, but I never stopped to think about that. Maybe someone else in the room would like to comment, but I do find it a very interesting idea. Makes sense, yeah.
I have just a brief comment on technology and maybe a provocation for David, who can talk about this later on. Think of Plato. He was against writing as a technology because it was against the presence, I don't know the terminology of the spirit. So he did make a polemic, but along the history of humanity, new technologies disrupt. And on the other hand, I think you were right in one thing, conservative movements. It sounds paradoxical, but conservative movements have a very early adoption of technology. Think of the futurism in Italy. Think of the use of technology in Nazi Deutschland by Hitler. Think of people who are big in technology today in our world. But on the other hand, there is a discussion of technology as an extension of the human mind, an extension of the human body. So we are civilized because we have technologies. So you just have to know how to deal with that, and just have to know how to deal with power. But maybe you should go back to translation. So maybe we could leave it for now. So we have 10:45. We give the floor to David. He speaks, and then we come back. As I then, I'll translate, I'm thinking in German now. Does anyone else have any questions, direct questions to Alice? If not, we can give the floor to David, if you are okay with that. Is it okay? I mean, here we just decide ad hoc. Just make a short parenthesis. we had a big manifestation, a big public event against, I'll use the right word, fascism, in Rio de Janeiro on a Sunday. And we had big icons of the Brazilian culture and music, Caetano Veloso, Chico Buarque, Gilberto Gil. All those singers were over 80 now. And they were just improvising there at the top of a trio elétrico. So we're just improvising here too. So some creative chaos in our conversation. This should not be academic in the very traditional sense. So if everyone is okay with that, we give David the floor. And I cut my microphone.
Okay, thank you. No, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, Asanda, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I am sorry I joined the meeting at the. I think you were about to finish with your presentation. But I would like to know when we talk about language and meaning, looking at the complexities involved, especially in developing languages or in developing nations. And when we include the invention of AI, because I would believe that in the developing nations or in the developing world, it was only when they were starting to come into the discipline of translation and trying to understand it. Let's say in the case of South Africa, translation is fairly young, it's really young. And looking at it in terms of philosophy and practice. So my question will be the future of translation, especially in these developing nations, and the involvement of AI, artificial intelligence, vis-a-vis comparing to the United Nations, as we mentioned before, and the European Union or the EU.
Wow, Asanda, thank you very much. Asanda is one of our doctoral candidates in South Africa, and it's lovely that you're here. Today is a holiday in South Africa, actually. It's Heritage Day. So I really appreciate the fact that you're taking the holiday to take part in this talk, Asanda. That's a very good question, and I think we can come back to it also later, but just not to leave it hanging. I think there are a few different points there. I mean, I don't know if this is obvious to everyone. The place Asanda is coming from is South Africa as a nation with 12 official languages, but until recently, until 30 years ago, it only had 2 official languages, right? English and Afrikaans. But it's a very multilingual, radically multilingual nation that is trying to officially recognize and foster all these languages at the same time. So that's a big challenge, and that's a beautiful challenge if you ask me. And so I think, Asanda, if I understand you correctly, you're asking yourself, okay, what's going to happen in relation to AI, but also looking into translation philosophy in South Africa. I think one important point that we need to consider is that these large language models on which AI is predicated, they don't really work well with, for example, South African languages, precisely because the language models are not large. For good or for ill, right? This is a fact. So even when we talk about machine translation, if you look at the quality of machine translation from, say, between English and German, and then you look at the quality of machine translation between Estonian and Greek, to take 2 European languages, and then, I don't know, isiZulu and Xitsonga, I mean, the quality just declines dramatically because there's less material for these machines to work with. So ironically, I think that's also one of the reasons why translation studies and interpreting studies is booming in South Africa. I mean, our department specifically is growing a lot, and I know that this is a trend across the country, because there isn't this fear as much as it is in Europe, for example, that we're all being replaced by machines and learning languages is pointless. Again, this is a very long discussion. I think the relationship with multilingualism in South Africa is also completely different than, say, in Europe, and I presume in the US as well, right? But David can come in there later. So I think in terms of practice, this big threat of AI is not nearly as big in South Africa. The language is in a completely different moment, also linguistically and in terms of language policy as well. Now, philosophically, and that's how I end my answer to your question. What I see, and I mean, I started in South Africa only a few years ago, so I don't want to make any categorical statements here, but I see many resemblances with Brazil, in the sense that many sort of colonial models were imported, or not imported is not the right word, were taken and sort of forced upon that place, and they've come to shape how we think about translation, right? I think it's very similar there if we compare Brazil and South Africa. And so I think there is a lot of potential for, you know, African ways of thinking. That's why I mentioned Ubuntu before, but obviously there are, you know, lots of other options. But, you know, African ways of thinking to also permeate and leave a permanent imprint on how we understand translation. And I guess that's why I also sort of insist a lot in my work on the notion of different epistemologies, right? Paulo and I talk about that by email sometimes, to just open up translation studies, which is, I mean, obviously what we're talking about, but any discipline, open up to different ways of thinking, really sometimes radically different ways of creating knowledge, of perceiving knowledge, etc., etc. And I think South Africa is a very interesting place to do that, and obviously Brazil as well, but many other sort of post-colonial settings, because we can work with what was taken and sort of imposed on us, if you like, but then we also have a lot that is our own, and it's, I think, impossible to reject what came from Europe in this case, and it doesn't make sense to do that either. I think we can work together and combine and come up with something genuinely new, and that really sort of moves away from the discussions that we've been having around translation for 2,000 years, right? Around fidelity and around equivalence, etc. I think it's only when we tap into these other traditions and these other ways of thinking, these other epistemologies, that we will really be able to talk about translation in a new way. And so I find South Africa extremely exciting, but obviously me being Brazilian, I see that in Brazil as well, this potential for something genuinely new and perhaps slightly disconcerting or perplexing that I would very much like to push. And I'll stop talking now. Thank you, Asanda. Ngiyabonga kakhulu.
Thank you, Alice. Just a short follow-up on me, and I thank you so much for your response, which is quite opening and highlighting so many aspects. But now, as you've made the example of South Africa, which I think what is lacking in South Africa, academics or who are writing about translation in South Africa. So when you talk about opening up the new avenues of epistemology, which is something that I feel like it is quite lacking. So how can we tap into these new avenues, into these new creations, into these new inventions, if we still lacking so much in terms of writing and theories that are coming from this side of the world?
Yeah, I think that's an important issue for us to discuss. And I think it can only be resolved by having people like you, for example, who finish their masters and they say, I will do a PhD and I will start contributing to this South African voice in translation studies. I'll start creating it, I'll start building it and working with others. And I think there's a very interesting group of people doing that at the moment, and this voice is emerging, and it's just a question of time until it kind of establishes itself. I mean, at least that's how I see it. Maybe just to wrap up and contextualize, I think we often say that in South Africa, that when you read, you know, volumes on translation studies, there's this effort to go beyond Europe and beyond the global north, as one likes to say now, or the United States, etc. And so there's a little bit about South America, there's a little bit about China. Sometimes it feels like sort of token contributions here and there to say, okay, this is truly international. But Africa is pretty much never there. So I think this is what Asanda is talking about. Yeah, and this is something that we're working towards changing, right, Asanda?
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Alice.
Thanks, Sunda. Thanks, Alice. Talking about epistemologies, I think David's work has something very important to say about epistemology and how we understand this tradition of over 2,000 years that Alice just mentioned. But that's up to him to say, to tackle this question from the point of view that he chooses. So I'll just give the floor to David, please.
Paulo and Lauro and Leila, though they're not here, I'm so deeply grateful for having been included in this session. I thank you very much and wholeheartedly. And I was delighted to hear Rosemary Araujo invoked at the outset. She's very much a reason for our connections and a channel for the ways we've connected. And I wish you were here. I also wish her well with whatever she's doing. And I hope it's enjoyable. The question of the future of translation that Asanda raised immediately reminded me of a situation yesterday in a class that I teach that's called Philosophy and Literature. And a student asked something about futures of art, and then sort of shrugged and said that there was no telling what was on the horizon. And I offered that every future has a history or histories. And that was my immediate response to that phrase. I thought that I would begin with just a statement on the Parmenides and translation, figures of motion, figures of being, but instead, that question reminds me more of a project that the three of us have discussed, at least in passing by email, which is currently in production with SUNY. It's called Breaking Light Towards a Poetics of Opacity in Early Greek Thinking. And I look in that book, which is scheduled for May of next year, at the Milesians, Thales and Anaximandros and Anaximenes. As figures who, at the traditionally narrated dawn of philosophy for the Greeks, articulate an experience of opacity, by which I mean the irreducible that we encounter in experience of the world, and that tends to be concealed by familiarity and by ordinary involvements in activities and so on, and then eventually is concealed and even challenged by conceptual thinking that wants to determine this or that object according to a prescribed and fairly strictly delimited kind of definitional program. And then the result of the conceptual thinking is the excision or removal of what doesn't conform to the concept as it's defined. I mean, I take that to be the central motivating concern of Theodor Adorno's work, and recognizing the violence that's inherent in that mode of thinking. My suggestion in this book called Breaking Light is that at what we are taught is the dawn of philosophy among the Greeks, there's a really different orientation that's not well described in terms of clarity, which is how Aristotle approaches the history of philosophy, as advances in clarity, ultimately towards the causal accounts that he'll develop. Instead of clarity, and again, I take that to be a criterion really articulated in Aristotle, at work in Plato, and germinating in the 5th century sophists who begin to extract what they take to be doctrine from the earlier thinkers who carry out their thinking in ancient Greek. I suggest opacity as another beginning that might forecast in the early moments, first stirrings of philosophy among the Greeks, might forecast or gesture towards a future where the insistence on clarity and transparency is another way to put that. And I think putting it as transparency connects it more explicitly to translation studies and its discussions. Opacity will offer a different mode that's always ready for more, for the abundances that are active wherever we turn, and that excuse me, that was the chimes, the music of the spheres over here telling me I've almost expired my allotted time. Opacity hopefully inspires multiple approaches, multiple attempts, and continual attempts, not to try to exhaust this or that, which we encounter and engage, but a much more hospitable approach that's unconcerned with finalizing, unconcerned with settling the dynamics that we experience wherever we turn, as I said a moment ago. To do that work in Breaking Light, I summoned Edouard Glissant, who was the poet, philosopher, dramatist, essayist from Martinique, and some of what he has done to develop the notion of opacity. And while translation isn't the primary theme in that the work I've been describing, it's a regular thread, maybe the golden thread, that connects my discussions of Thales and Anaximandros and Anaximenes, and then in the concluding parts, I try to make it more explicit as involved with translation always already implying translation and translational actions. One of my interests is in, and I think I think this is a shared interest, really widening and opening up the ways we understand translation as an interpretive approach, as a practice, as an embedded and indissoluble feature of philosophy and other fields. And I hope that, I'm going to end on this note, I hope that publications that I've delivered to communities that aren't directly involved in translation studies, scholarly communities specialized in ancient philosophy or in comparative literature, I hope that those are provoking and inspiring further and more rigorous attention to translation in the area of philosophy, and in my case, specifically in the area of ancient philosophy studies. I think there's much more to be done and said. In a way, and this is the last point, which is really just a restatement of what I tried to say a moment ago. Launching studies like that into communities that might not see themselves as engaged with translation and translation studies, hopefully is a kind of invitation and that opening up of the community of translation and translation studies that Alice, that you described at the beginning of your talk. I think that's just so essential. And I think it's actually one guiding spirit of philosophy, a hospitable, welcoming stance towards others. Oh, and yeah, okay, the very last note. There it is. I don't have a screenshot of it, but that's this arrived a few weeks ago, and I'm very delighted with the way they carried out the design, and I'm, as usual, I love having it in my hands.
I put it in the chat. I put a link in the chat, and as I Googled it and I saw the cover for the first time, I was like, yeah, very good. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. My younger children were deeply involved in choosing of the 4 cover designs that were suggested. They both weighed in on this one, as did Sarah. Thank you.
Kids are the best for these things, huh? Very good.
Yeah, yeah.
David, thanks for this. May I introduce a question that establishes a bridge between what you've just said and we're just discussing and the book you just presented?
Sure.
Because maybe you could comment on one thing that I've been working in. You talk about the so-called classical determination of philosophy in this book, which whose cover just showed.
Right.
And you make the history, let's say, the archaeology of how this concept came into being. And if I understand you right, translation moved in ancient Greece from different places and assumed different forms. I have a friend who is a teacher for philosophy of education. And when we talk about Parmenides, that's the figure of essence. That's the figure of no immutability, let's say, something that stays. And if I understand your book right, and like I say, I have read it already, so what you're saying about Parmenides unsettles the image we have from Parmenides. So could you comment on how Parmenides cannot be, if I understand it right, or can be understood as founder of the classical determination of essence, of immutability? How do you unsettle this idea of the classical determination in the book that already appeared, not in the book that your
Yes.
book that will appear next year? If we can start with this one now.
Right.
I hope the question is clear.
Yes, I think so. I think I tried to do that in a slightly different way in each of the chapters in Parmenides and Translation. In the first chapter, I tried to bring to light his position within what I was calling the hexameter thinking tradition, that is that activates mobility and that takes place as mobility. I discuss that in terms of translation in Parmenides and Translation. I look at features of the language that survives, that's only survives in reports that come considerably later. And I stress the opening image of Parmenides, which is often just dismissed as allegorical or as a traditional proem that is of no philosophic importance. And I try to make it central to the poem and to the thinking. And I try to stress the interaction that's the kind of center point of the poem, even though in the surviving passages, it's just one voice, the voice of the goddess. She's speaking to the narrator, and this already disrupts assertions of unity, for example, which I believe are associated with the reductive essence-related translation, kind of approach to translation. The classical determination, which is, by the way, a phrase that I borrow from John Sallis, whose memory I'd like to invoke. He passed away this year, and he was obviously a major figure in introducing and developing and teaching 20th century European philosophies in America. In the second chapter, I look to the oral tradition and try to think about how a performed Parmenides also disrupts that classical determination. Again, because of the inherent multiplicity, audience and performer, and then the multiplicity within the poem itself, the performer performing different roles and different parts and possibly modulating speech to indicate those roles within the poem's narrative. The translation that I'm sure appears wild and fantastic, and yet is meant to enact figures of motion and figures of being, with presenting the text as I translate it in various configurations like that. They did such a good job setting this up. I was worried that a lot of this would be a challenge and too difficult, and it might even not be transmitted when I send my document to them. But Peter Lang just did a wonderful job setting up the figures of motion. I mean, that's the core of this text. I translate in an audacious way, just to try to ask people to reconsider, to turn again to Parmenides, and try to suspend those interpretive suppositions that a long history of teaching philosophy and ancient philosophy have established for approaches to Parmenides. And then the other mode I take is in that poetics of translation that I offer after the translation itself, in terms of what archaeology and daimonology and erotics, though not in that order. I took that as an opportunity to theorize not so much translation, but this moment of translating Parmenides. And I wanted that to be, I wanted to register that this was site-specific and trying not to participate in the generalizing tendency that I think has come up in some of what Alice has discussed in this session. That's an overview, Paulo, to ways I hope to, what did you say, shake or disrupt the convention? Yeah. Thank you for asking.
Thank you for this. I'll have more questions, but I'll leave the floor for other people. I'll come back if there are no questions.
Okay.
Or comments.
Could I possibly just quickly establish a connection with something that I should have said before? And then hopefully that will give time to the audience as well if they would like to ask any questions or make any comments. Paulo, is that okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. Let me just first say that I think this in general, this turn to the pre-Socratics and sort of pre-Socratic thinking is another space for us to try and escape certain dominant epistemologies or dominant ways of looking at translation. And I think that's one of the reasons why I appreciated your book so much, David, and I hope to see more coming out of it and in this discussion. And I think there are others. This Barbara Cassin, for example, turns to Protagoras and others and the sophists to look into, again, possible, genuinely new, although very old, avenues of thought. New in the sense that, again, they disrupt what we understand today when we think of translation, more generally speaking. But anyway, what I should have mentioned about these two works that I said are important to me today, I mean, obviously my personal history. So the journal on the one hand, and this volume I edited with Larissa, which I'm going to paste in the chat. There's a link to it. I hope it works. So let's start with that. I mean, this book contains a chapter by Paulo, actually, which is called On Visibility, a Wittgensteinian stance, and contains a postface written by David, which is called Envisioning Invisibility with a dash. So obviously, I mean, we also came together in this project, and I think some of what David was saying at the beginning in terms of opacity versus clarity, and then taking clarity, associating it with transparency, and then associating it with visibility. I think that all sort of came across both in Paulo's chapter and in your postface. So that's a nice way also to see these works coming together. And in the journal, let me just paste a link to you. So like I said, the journal is ready. You can already see a lot of publications there, but the first special issue is going to come out in the next few days. And you can already see that there are not one, but two reviews of David's new book, the one he's just mentioning, right, on Parmenides. So Parmenides in translation, the link is in the chat as well. If you click there, you can see that there are 2 reviews that Paulo kindly wrote with Bruno Palavro. Is that right? I always want to say Palava. I don't know why, because of German, I think. Paulo, is it right?
Today. He couldn't be here today. It's a pity, but anyhow, that's what's fact.
But I'm glad you worked together on this very interesting bilingual review. So it's 2 separate reviews, one in English, one in Portuguese. So if you're interested in David's work and what he was explaining now, right, about what he does in that work and what he does with the Parmenidean poem, etc., you can maybe read the review first and then get the book and read that as well. So that's just a connection I wanted to make.
So I will post another link to a book that somehow is in a dialogue to what David talks about in the book, and it's a book by Larissa Cercel, who is Romanian, translation as event. And David might remember that we have a contribution in the volume to José Maria Rojo by a colleague who works in Paraná, where Alice was born, if I understand it right. Ruth Bogunovsky, she writes about translating for the theater, for the stage. And there is this dimension of performativity in her book. And I think it might interest you. And I might have lost the question I wanted to put to David, but let's let the floor to the audience, so I might remember. Please, any questions, any comments on David? If not, I'll have a comment, ask. We're talking to Bruno. One thing that caught up our attention is that you somehow translate the figures of motion, specialize time, and you are talking also to Haroldo de Campos, or who is the one, Brazilian concrete poetry. I just remember the question. The other question is more important. You talk about poetry, the Parmenidean poem, and you talk about philosophy. And it seems that we have in the history a separation of tasks, so that argumentative discourse is the task of philosophy, and then you have literary work or art with a different task. There is a bytrack, there is a paper, there is a contribution by Philip Wilson on philosophy, on translation. He talks about different ways of making philosophy in the history of in the Western history. So he's talking about a similar thing as you are. And just yesterday, I read the first revision of a paper by Rafael Azizi, who is hosting us in his philosophy department. And he's talking about taking this division too far, philosophy and literature, setting them apart. There's also a colleague of mine at USP. I just forgot her name. I'm getting old. I forgot all the names, but it doesn't matter. How much epistemic value there is in literature. So could you maybe comment a little bit on how the epistemic dimension of Parmenides' poem or poetry should we unsettle this separation, not taking it so far away, and say that philosophy must only be in this essay form? If I understand you right, there is an epistemic dimension to Parmenides' poem, and to the Old Greek. I may not have understood it right. Could you comment on that?
Emphasizing what is conventionally called the poetic dimension of what's attributed to Parmenides. It is an attempt to undo, or at least trouble, the hardened distinction that you were articulating, Paulo, between philosophy and literature. I mean, so much of philosophy is literature, and I don't mean that in a very technical sense, but just in the sense that it's written and available for translations, and yet at the same time there is a distinction some people want to insist on between the philosophic and the literary. It doesn't, with the area on which I specialize, it just doesn't apply very well. I think it helps to address poetic aspects, okay, talking about it within the framework, the conventional framework, poetic aspects throughout traditions of philosophy in its various forms, because of what it signals to interpreters and readers, rather than an approach that's going to try to get it right and get the message so that it's easily conveyable, in which I take to be an approach to philosophic texts. I want to distill it and capture the essential message and then repeat it or convey it to others in a repeatable way. Poetry, I think, does not call for that. I think it calls for something else, for the many, for continual rereadings, and for a readiness for surprise that the language can provoke, even in poems that have been read many times. I imagine that's, I hope that's a common experience and not just my own. If you return to a poem repeatedly, often it's been in my experience that a line, a phrase, a word just sparkles differently this time, reading it on one occasion than on another. I think that's the heart of what I'm trying to address and promote in troubling the boundaries between philosophy and literature. The sense of wonder that philosophy at one time was said to provoke, and from which it was said to begin, sense of wonder, and the uncertainty that accompanies wonder, the awe and delight and perplexity that come along with that, that perhaps is deactivated by some philosophic approaches.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question, Paulo. Thank you.
The floor is open. You just can open your hearts. No one is going to censor you. Alice, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a difficult question, David. I hope you don't hate me. But I can't resist it. And the question is the following. What do you think the world would look like? Perhaps not the world, let's make it a bit narrower. What do you think perhaps philosophy or translation studies or maybe academic disciplines would look like if, and then I have to generalize, perhaps you talk about Parmenides, but I would say pre-Socratic thought had become more dominant instead of especially Platonic ways of looking, especially at language now. But Aristotelian as well, in terms of how we argue with each other and how we construct arguments and knowledge and rhetoric and all of that. Do you think the landscape of academic disciplines would be very different, for example, if Parmenides were, or Protagoras or others were, sorry, as dominant as, for example, Plato or Aristotle?
Of course, I will never hate you, Alice, especially not for asking a question, no matter how difficult. And that's a very difficult question. You know what came to mind? The city that's described in the Republic and then abandoned in Plato's Republic. It's a city that doesn't have philosophy. And instead, the citizens stand around a fire telling stories and gazing at the stars. I'm not sure that that's what academics would, how it would appear had we followed different trajectories. But that was my first thought. A willingness, this might be the main aspect of it that comes to mind. There might be less emphasis on refutation and establishing a point that's ready to be defended. I mean, look at our institutional language. We defend dissertations. Yeah. This is combative, even if we don't approach it that way. And Rosemary was on my examining committee and did not in the least approach it that way. So in part, it's just a language, it's just a residue in the language, but still it remains. And one often reads academic writing that is polemic and is, if not polemic, identifiable as academic insofar as it's advancing a position, a thesis, or a position that's going to be defended. I think to me that might be the greatest difference had a different another trajectory taken place.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That helps me a lot. I like to, I've mentioned this before, I think, especially Barbara Cassin, when she writes about pre-Socratics, she says that she thinks that, you know, if that had become a sort of a dominant way of thinking, the way that, for example, Plato's writings became dominant, you know, the sophists would just drive everyone mad asking them questions. But what does this really mean? And is it really like that? And does it really have to be like that? Questions about language, right? And I find it very amusing to think that perhaps our academic disciplines will be, I find it more interesting, perhaps a bit more confusing, but more interesting if we had that kind of sort of policy, right, towards knowledge and towards thinking, just to be provoking each other constantly and saying, but what do you actually mean? But does that actually mean what you're saying, etc.? And also, I think the idea of dichotomies, right, that perhaps we would, I don't know what you think, but maybe we would have a more relaxed way of looking at them. And perhaps post-structuralist thought in many ways has managed to achieve that we look at dichotomies and we take them with a very large pinch of salt today. But obviously, they still very much permeate the way the way we think and the way we build knowledge, right? So just ideas. And again, just to justify my question, I ask that because I often think about post-colonial settings, right? Again, so Brazil, South Africa, and obviously we inherited this kind of Platonic, or we should say Greco, Latin, or Christian. I mean, there are many different ways of framing it, right? And then I think, okay, if we could change certain elements of it, then what would be the result? And perhaps what can we still change? What can we add to the mix, right, in terms of what remains? And especially when I look at South Africa, there's so much there that I feel that hasn't been explored. So that's where my curiosity comes from. Thank you, David.
The floor is open. If no one asks a question or makes a comment, you have always the danger that I'll make one. Well, let me formulate this thing, and maybe we're going without any clear cut into a general discussion. I suppose everyone here in this virtual room works with translation and in the sense of the humanities. We talk about translation studies, but translation studies was created as an academic area, but then it was divided into many sub-areas. That's one topic that Mauricio talks about in the contribution to your book or our book, David. I don't know if there's maybe the first book. There's another book by David, Translations Treason, and then Mauricio was there too. And this division that actually there are so many subdivisions in translation studies that do not actually talk to each other. It's just like some divisions in space in Brazilian academics. You don't know the people whose office is next to yours. You don't talk to them. You maybe talk more to people who are like me in South Africa, in the States. So isn't it now a big challenge that humanities, the defense of humanities, and I think this is one big problem that we are facing now. Rafael Azizi organized the book with many Brazilian colleagues, but also people in South and North America, the defense of humanities. And there is an assault of in humanities. A couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting here at Unicamp with the people from Taylor and Francis, who came to talk about the importance of the university work in, and we have 93% or more in open source. But sociology and humanities have difficulty in foundings and have difficulties in acceptance. How strong is this trend for translation studies? Isn't it one of the tests of a philosophy of translation with some kind of philosophical background to engage in this fight? I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud. See, there is this segmentation in the field of translation studies. Is it an inner dialogue possible? And how can translation studies or philosophy of translation or or philosophy help us to, you see, if we live in a technological age where you're losing many things. We have a colleague, Maria Paula Frota. She talked about the importance of love in translation, and aren't we not?
Paulo. Oh no, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, maybe it's just some.
Paulo seems to have lost a connection or frozen.
Possibly, I guess it's just something on Paulo's side, and I was just double checking. Perhaps we could wait a minute, but if not, I suppose we can also just take, you know, the sort of the question and the idea that he just threw into the room. Let's see. Yeah, he left, but I'm sure he'll be right back. It was probably a connection thing. Yes, Eva, would you like to come in? We can't hear you yet.
Yes, thank you, Alice. Can you hear me now? Okay. His question is very interesting because it puts everything in perspective. And I think that we should look at the humanities as being in motion. So translation can help in the sense that, if I understood the question correctly, it's understanding across difference, you know, like, because we can see the world is polarized by nationalism, xenophobia, and so many other things. But translation insists on saying something like, you are not alone in your language, you know? And this is something much deeper than, you know, what people think about translation studies, translation as a practice. And I also think that nowadays with AI, we overlook the aspect of ethical work. Ethics is very important. And if we go beyond ethical aspects in AI, as a translator, it involves a certain humility, listening, you know, and the acknowledgement that no understanding is perfect, you know, and that there's all a genuine understanding that is partial. And we also need to understand where everyone is coming from. And then translation is also political in a way. And you were talking about the global south, global north. So I think there's also this aspect: who gets translated, who doesn't, who speaks for whom, you know? So I think that translating is bound up in power, visibility, and global hierarchies. And you mentioned that earlier, and it was mentioned. So in a sense, I would say that translation is a model for the humanities because it helps bridging gaps between people, times, ways of knowing, you know. And when we look at translation that way, it's actually very important. And the humanities are probably one of the most important faculties. I'm not saying that the other faculties are not important, but if it were to disappear, I don't know where human intelligence and creativity would be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. I absolutely agree with you. Paulo, I'm glad you're back. So Eva was commenting on your question, actually. Just this idea of the defense of the humanities and where translation sort of finds its place and does it have a place in this battle, etc. So thank you very much, Eva. Let me give the floor back to you because you were still finishing your question, right, Paulo?
Just go ahead. I mean, it happened what I thought could happen. That's the reason you're a co-host. Just go ahead with the discussion. I'll just set a couple of things here.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I'm the ad hoc host. I'm just going to maybe come back to what Eva said, and also, I mean, the notes I was taking while Paulo was speaking. I think speaking specifically to this fragmentation of translation studies, perhaps, I guess I would prefer to point in a different direction. I think there are many universities in the world that are kind of moving away from this model of disciplines and are trying to think in a more transdisciplinary way. And I know this has become a bit of a buzzword and we have to be careful so that it doesn't become something empty, right? But you have, for example, in certain places in the UK, for example, you have something called area studies. When you try, you can't really place someone in a particular discipline, then you can place them in area studies. It almost always works, right? Not always, but So just to move away from disciplinary borders, especially, I mean, going back to what I said before about Derrida and the notion of community. When a discipline becomes something closed that wants to enforce an inside and an outside, which I think is what mainstream translation studies has done, I think it really impoverishes itself, and it really misses out on an opportunity to learn from this incoming of the other, right? Again, to use deconstruction here. So I like it very much, for example, when David says, okay, let's look at poetry, let's look at different areas and see what they have to say about translation. And then to link that with what you just said, Eva, of course, I mean, translation is everywhere in the humanities and beyond, but let's stay with the humanities, right? If we look at most departments, if not all departments in the humanities, they will be predicated on translation as a fact, as a practice, again, to go back to that dichotomy, but also translation as a metaphor in terms of what you put beautifully as a possibility for us to communicate with each other at all. What that possibility that brings us together despite our differences, despite our linguistic, cultural, etc. differences. So translation becomes this pivotal metaphor that explains why this possibility exists and also justifies our differences in a way. So of course, I mean, I think this is the moment, and perhaps it is with the emergence of AI, that these discussions become more urgent and perhaps more evident. I mean, hopefully more evident. Paulo.
The floor is open. I mean, it's, you know, but I mean, you named me, so we can maybe look at the glass as, or the bottle as half full, not half empty. It seems to me that the tools we have at our disposal now free us to do some more work on reflection and just outsource much of the terminological work load we had to do before. We lost a lot of time looking after things, at the right terminology, looking at whoever has written. Now, our task seems to be a little bit to bring the reflection into it, to bring the human dimension into it. I read some time ago a report, a paper on artificial intelligence written by some people from the Mozilla Foundation and some professors in the United States, that artificial intelligence needs human supervision. That's the one thing. And the other thing is this discussion of Plato I mentioned before. I mean, Plato was against writing, and people were against calculators, and then people were against computers, and people were against tractors. Well, just see these things as an extension of what we do and concentrate on what translation, artificial intelligence cannot do. Poetry. I've heard people saying that translation, memories of translation software can generate poetry. Some people say it can generate art. I would contest that. Art that's generated by artificial intelligence is not art. Art is breaking up with expectations. At least today in the 20th century, I would say already in the 20th century. So there's this creative part of translation. That's where we should maybe invest on that and give value to that. And the rest, well, what the machine can do, let the machine do it. But we know we can do it better and we can do it differently. And I see Eva wants to speak, please.
Yes, thank you. It's Eva or Eva. I've heard it also. Don't worry, it's fine. Thank you so much, Paolo, for this. I agree with you so much because I also think that AI lacks the human creativity, and that relates to what we were talking about earlier when David mentioned human intelligence. I think that the more we specialize, so for example, I'm writing my research on medical translation and multimodality. And Alice is actually my supervisor. So thank you, Alice, for your guidance. And, you know, while doing that research, I see that there's a lot that AI cannot do because, for example, if you think in terms of how meaning is used, how meaning is created, how meaning is made, using models, for example, using culture, for example, then how can AI really translate using those different elements? So what we can do as researchers is guide, you see, like the conversation, change the discourse, maybe to increase or to actually invite people to look at translation differently. So for instance, for translation, medical translation, we know that a bad translation can cause death or can have terrible health impact. So then it means that maybe we need to look a little bit more at how the patients understand. So it means we need to look at the culture. Can AI really add that cultural element? If we look also at marketing, for example, I think that markets are different. The target audiences are different. And then can AI really create something that is based on all those elements? You see, and you mentioned poetry. You know, I tried once, just to see what like ChatGPT or other AI would come up with. It was complete. I don't even want to say the term, but I didn't understand anything, and it lost actually even the spirit of the text was gone. And that gave me hope because I thought, like you said, AI is just a tool. And when you look at the history of where AI comes from, because it's not from today, a lot of people are like, oh, AI is here, but actually since 1960 and even before. So it's just that now everyone is talking about it, but humans have always been at the center of AI and they've been actually feeding those machines. So I think there's still a lot to do, but indeed we have to adapt and we have to guide the conversation. Thank you.
Here we are again on AI topic. I only want to add that, yes, I agree it's important to differentiate human and artificial intelligence. I believe it's called artificial intelligence in part because it's intended to resemble human intelligence. And so we might also keep track of and attend to the ways that has been accomplished. I fear that that will be anxiety provoking, to say the least, to confront the resemblances that we find between what's called artificial intelligence and human intelligence.
So I see we are approaching 2 hours time, and I don't know if you'd like to make some concluding remarks, if our guests would like, or if there is any other things. We were not going to work like in Britain that we have to cut at 2 hours exactly. But I mean, it's your time, you're busy, so we should start concluding. Would anyone would like to make some comments on going in this direction? I excuse myself for what happened here, but it's Brazil. We had some bad weather here. I was hoping this was not happening. It was not going to happen, but it does. I mean, that's Murphy's law. If it happens, it may happen. It will at some time happen. So any concluding remarks, David or Alice? I mean, I thank you very much for your time. It was difficult to find the time. We could, I mean, I have at least 50 emails. And yes, I would like to remind, we're talking about creativity, that Larissa CSL has a research center with this focus, and this is in the invitation. I didn't find it now, but I mean, you find in the invitation a link to much of it is in German, but I mean, there are some publications also in English and French. I don't know if they have in Portuguese, but I mean, creativity has been a topic that is always has been. And coming back to José Maria Rojo, that's also one of the topics we have learned to discuss based on her work. I mean, creativity as a part of, and then we can go back to hermeneutics, creativity as a part of any human understanding. So that's the point with artificial intelligence that works with large language models. You just say what most people would say, but I mean, to put it in the right context, to create the right context, to understand, and then to understand what the target audience, what's that context. I mean, it demands creativity. So with this hint to Larissa, who could not be here today, and I'll ask if our guests would like to make some final comments. And thank you again for your time and disposition to talk with us. A small cycle, but I hope it was a very productive talk.
In German, we say klein, aber fein, right?
Never fine.
Small, but good, very good. It's difficult to translate. Anyway, klein, aber fein. Yeah. Thank you very much, Paulo. I think it's a very nice way of ending the discussion on AI as well, to remind ourselves that there's this statistical aspect to it, which I think makes it all the more scary, right? I think, do we really want to always sort of produce something that's based on what the majority of what is online, right? Actually.
Yeah.
Would say or would do. And I think that's something that especially younger people are not aware of. I've had some interesting chats with students of mine who used AI for their assignments and were then very shocked when I pointed out to them, you know, where those texts were coming from. So I think it's also a question of having these conversations, understanding how these technologies work, and on the other hand, emphasizing the human aspect that's inherent to translation, again, as a practice, but also just as a metaphor, or as Eva was saying, that which enables us to communicate with each other across cultures and linguistic differences, etc., etc. I'd like to end by saying that if you're interested in this, if you're interested in these discussions, you may be interested in the journal that I'm talking about. We're really trying hard to create a place where you can publish in different languages, where you can take unexpected approaches, where, you know, you can disrupt. We were talking about disruption before. You can disrupt, you can subvert. So maybe have a look at it, reach out if you have any questions. We're also trying to be very open linguistically, right? So not publish in English only, but find creative solutions to incorporate different languages. And also, if you just feel like chatting about this, I mean, we do have these meetings every now and then. Let me post this in the chat. Paulo mentioned this group at the beginning, which is called Philosophy in On Translation. So if you click this link, you can sign up. We have a meeting coming up, I think, next week.
Yep, beginning of October.
Exactly. And then we can, you know, we just get together, you can talk, we have breakout rooms in different languages. Then in the main room, we speak English, but we do mix a little bit as well when the need arises. So if you feel like discussing matters that are relevant in this intersection of translation and philosophy, I think these are two interesting places to start, even if I do say so myself. Thank you very much, Paulo. Thank you, David, and thanks everyone.
Thank you, Alice. I would like to add something to what Alice said. I was recently asked to prepare a paper in English, an English version of a paper that I published in German by USP. And then I reminded the colleagues that maybe we should do also the other way around. And that's the initiative of this translation in philosophy group that Alice is engaged with. Why not, instead of always publishing in English, also publish a vernacular version of those papers that we publish in English? I put this, raised this issue at the meeting with Taylor and Francis. I mean, we talk about internationalization. This is an issue we talked about with David too. I mean, David, most of the people who wrote that paper in homage on José María Rojo were not English speaking people. There was a minority. But if we always publish in English, because that's an international community, it's the lingua franca. But do people speak English in our universities? I can say no. I worked for 30 years at the Language Center at the University of Campinas, and I can certainly say, I can say with a high degree of certainty, that most people have difficulties reading in English. So if our research is going to be published only in English, and that's the importance of Alice's initiative and her group, we're exporting our thought. We have to publish also in the vernacular. We have to publish, I don't know in how many languages in South Africa. That's your problem there. You have to publish. And you can even maybe use those tools for easier production of the vernacular language. It's not so expensive. So this might be an interesting crusade. Okay, people, publish in English or perish, but also publish in Portuguese, publish in Ubuntu, publish in whatever language, in Guarani, I don't know, whatever language. It's important. So for the survival of language and cultures, that what we think and what we do, what we exchange, be also in the vernacular.
Paulo, I think that's so important. And oddly, it's only a step from the format some journals already have adopted, which is to ask for abstracts in multiple languages. But the paper itself ends up often only being available in English. So all I'm saying is that it's a short step from that multilingual abstract format to a multilingual full article format.
It doesn't cost much.
Sure.
It's not the price of a print of a book in print. So I'd say if you could engage in this direction everywhere where you are, we would be a step further in preserving what I call the language and culture ecology, preserving nature and preserving culture in languages. But David might want to say something. I don't know if you want your concluding words.
I don't know if they're concluding, but
no, I don't like conclusions. You like conclusions.
I don't either. On this topic, there's also a question of which English ends up in.
Yes. Yes.
We talked about that when we were working on transfiction and bordering approaches, the book in honor of Rosemary's work.
Mm-hmm.
I think only on one occasion has a project of mine that's been published been praised for the unconventional language in English. Every other review at some point makes the remark that that the language is too poetic, or too verbose? Could it be simplified? Could it be, more streamlined towards the academic norm? And I have made adjustments at times on those lines, but I've also at other times decided just to make a rebuttal to that reviewer comment saying, since when have people asked for a different way of expressing this or that from the conventional academic English? It's rare, and it's homogenizing, and it's reductive and simplifying. This is a problem. It's an epistemic problem, which is, of course, a connection with Alice and Larissa's recent publication, with the journal, and with this project. Thank you so very much for organizing it, Paulo. I appreciate it.
Okay,
Great.
let's hope that many people get access to this when it is at YouTube. I think it's the channel, but you take some time, but we'll have it. So we might stop here. Thank you, everyone, for interest. And when it's public, I will just send you the link, and you might publicize it, and so that more people have access to it. Thank you very much. Some people in the north, most of us in the south. I think David's the only one who is now in the north. So be our guest.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon again.
Obrigada. Até a próxima.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Merci. Au revoir.
Tchau.
I'll just stop the recording.